Order, please. We'll start today's proceedings. Very wet morning out there, so we'll get started here as soon as we can. We'll start with the daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make some introductions in the East Gallery.
Certainly.
Today we have several representatives from student organizations, and as I call your name, perhaps I could ask you to stand. From the Canadian Federation of Students, Nova Scotia, we have Elise Graham, Gabe Hoogers, Rebecca Rose, and Kaylee Kennedy. Representing the Alliance of Nova Scotia Student Associations, Chris Saunier. And from the Student Assistance Division of the Department of Education, we have Carol Lowthers, Marianne Laba, and Matt Miller. And I ask my colleagues to give them a warm welcome. Mr. Speaker, the fact is, Nova Scotia's Student Assistance Program is among the weakest in the country, and some of our graduates have among the highest debt level in the country. And today we are acting on our Premier's commitment to change this. We are acting so our young people, and some older ones, can afford the education they need to prepare themselves for good jobs that grow the economy. Government was recently presented with a report on the university system in Nova Scotia by Dr. Tim O'Neill. And Dr. O'Neill points out that a post-secondary education is an excellent investment. University graduates earn $750,000 more than high school graduates over a lifetime. He also points out that students with the most limited resources available to them need more help. We agree. And Mr. Speaker, we are committed to addressing this challenge as part of our commitment to make life better and more affordable for families. At the same time, the total government support for universities exceeded $440 million in 2010-11. Taxpayers expect us to make the very best use of our post-secondary investments so student debt load goes down while maintaining our commitment to live within our means. We want to hear from students, parents, and all Nova Scotians to support the right decisions in meeting this objective. The department is holding 6 public meetings and an online video conference in French. For those unable to attend a meeting, submissions can also be made through a website. The consultation process will provide an opportunity to receive valuable feedback on how to improve student assistance. It will help government to engage stakeholders and identify options on types of assistance, grants and loans, levels of assistance, debt caps, and other operational improvements. It is now up to us, universities, government, students, and others to work together to make the right decisions that will ensure our universities remain affordable to students and strong, competitive institutions into the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Minister believes that student financial assistance is important, but her announcement today is of little value to individuals who are not able to access post-secondary education, those struggling to make it by while trying to complete their education, and those who are finished and trying to pay off their student loans. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a camera store buying a small camera for my son, and got chatting with the clerk. And the clerk said he had 7 years of post-secondary education. He had yet to complete his degree. He had $60,000 in debt. He was working in a camera store. His student loan payment was as much as his rent every month. And his story is typical of what's been going on here in Nova Scotia. In 2007, students pressured the government to do a financial aid review. There were student consultations across the province. And now today the minister is proposing to do the same consultations all over again. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad we're going to find out what people think. But I think we already know what the answers are. Why aren't we going back over that report? You know, I went on the website. I can't find that report on the website. So I'd like the minister to table a copy of those 2007 consultations. We should be going through it and make sure that students' concerns from back 3 years ago have actually been addressed. It appears that this government is making this announcement today to try to make it look like they're taking action now on student assistance before they raise tuitions. That's a recommendation that's contained in the deeply flawed O'Neill report. We've seen it time and time again from this government. They commission a report so they can break their promises. And I hope the government realizes that parents and students will not fall for these tricks. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the Minister for providing a copy of the statement prior to this morning. And I would like to acknowledge the students who are in the gallery. I've had an opportunity to meet with some of those students when I was the minister and also since I've become the critic for education. And I do congratulate the minister on providing opportunities to listen to what those students have to say. These are the young people, these are the bright minds in our communities, and these are the people who we need to listen to when we're looking at changes that may affect them directly. So I congratulate you, Minister, and I thank the students for being here and being willing to participate in the process. We know the information is clear. We've known this, and the member opposite referenced a study in 2007, and during the time 2007 to 2009, one of the things that our government did was to listen to students, and we tried to implement, and we did, I believe, implement some initiatives that were of benefit to students, and they acknowledged that. And it's because we listened to what they had to say. One of those things that we did was the tuition reduction initiative, which was to bring our tuition to the national average. We were well above the national average, and it took considerable resources from our government to be directed towards that initiative. The initiative was to be completed by 2010 with the tuition to the national average by that time. I have spoken to the minister, and I encourage her to ask her cabinet to support a continuation of a tuition reduction initiative that will allow tuition in Nova Scotia to stay at the national average. We recognize also that there are many costs related to study, and we also listened to students who said we need financial assistance up front. A tax credit at the end of a 4-year program is meaningless if you haven't had enough money to get to university to start with. So as a result of listening to students, there were upfront bursaries that were initiated, and students appreciated that. Their comment, it's great, it's not enough, I agree with them. So I'm hoping the minister, again, will continue to listen to that message. The other issue or the other initiative, I guess, that we believe helped students cope with the debt of education, post-secondary education, was the Memorandum of Understanding. And that MOU froze tuition so students could predict what their tuition was going to be over the course of the next 3 years. And in order for students to do the planning for their education, they need to have some reassurance that tuitions will not skyrocket at any time. So the Memorandum of Understanding, which froze tuition, allowed them to do some of that pre-planning. These are a few of the initiatives. I'm sure that the minister will hear messages from students when they go through the consultation process, and I'm not surprised that the messages will be much different. I'm just encouraging the minister to listen and respond. A couple of comments that I would like to make about the O'Neill report. Again, I've spoken to the minister about these, and two of them in particular that could directly impact negatively on students and their university costs. One is to lift the cap on tuition and allow universities to do what they will with tuition. And my concern is what they will do is put the debt on the backs of students, which I believe is totally unfair, and the MOU protected students from that. I'm hoping that the minister will consider that when she's reviewing the O'Neill report. The second recommendation in the O'Neill report has to do with lifting the cap on student loans. And again, I have to question the rationale behind that, because if students are allowed to borrow unlimited numbers of dollars, they will be left with a huge debt at the end of their post-secondary. The member has mentioned that. I know that 19% of students who have a student loan default on that. So let's not create a larger student loan and force students to study elsewhere. So I would encourage the minister to listen to the students, and I would encourage the students from their associations to speak up so the minister clearly understands what they need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, member. Any further statements by ministers? Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas chronic pain affects 15 to 20% or nearly 6 million Canadians daily, and whereas those affected by chronic pain often miss work, spend more time in hospital, and frequently visit their doctors in search of ways to alleviate their symptoms. And whereas Canadians of all ages who suffer from chronic pain feel vulnerable, devastated, and demoralized due to the many misconceptions and misunderstanding of their chronic condition, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize National Pain Awareness Week and commend the work of organizations such as the Canadian Pain Coalition to raise awareness of this chronic condition. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I should move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Halifax Stanfield International Airport celebrated 50 great years of service to Atlantic Canada in September, and whereas the airport was recently named and received a number of major awards, including just being named the Tourism Industry Association of Canada's Corporate Partner of the Year, and whereas Halifax Stanfield International Airport was deemed the world's best airport for overall passenger satisfaction in its class for the 7th straight year by Airports Council International. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Halifax International Airport on their excellent service on behalf of Nova Scotia and continued success into the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities has served communities across Nova Scotia for more than a century, and whereas Billy Joe McLean has long served the people of Port Hawkesbury as their mayor, and whereas Billy Joe McLean was confirmed as the new president of the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities on Thursday, October the 28th at their conference in Sydney. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House wish Billy Joe McLean every success as the new president of the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I please make an introduction?
Certainly.
In our West Gallery, I would like to draw your attention to a number of people who, if they want to stand when I read your name, and hopefully I won't forget anybody. Douglas Smith of the Nova Scotia Road Safety Youth Committee. Fred Phillips, the Tour Director for the Nova Scotia Ramblers. Bob White, Vice President of Bicycle Nova Scotia and founder of the Nova Scotia Ramblers. Andrew DeCaney. Peter Williams, Nova Scotia Bikeways Coalition, Scott McPhee of Clean Nova Scotia, Sandra Bennett of the Nova Scotia Ramblers, Mike Smith, Bike Nova Scotia, Marie-Claude Gregoire of ADAPT, and Gordon Tate of the Municipality of Chester. And Mr. Speaker, as you are probably aware, we rode from various points, including from Dartmouth. I rode with them today on our bikes to introduce this bill. We wish it was a bit sunnier. And I would also like to thank the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal for signaling yesterday afternoon that he also would support the legislation I'm about to introduce. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East begs leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 293, the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill number 84, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. Any further introduction of bills? The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 31 of the Act of 2004 of the Police Act.
The Honourable Minister of Justice begs leave to introduce a bill and act to amend Chapter 31 of the Acts of 2004, the Police Act.
Bill number 85, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 31 of the Acts of 2004, the Police Act.
Order this bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Alan and Violet Large of Truro were the fortunate winners of the lottery in July, a win of $11.25 million, but have always played the lottery for fun and not for financial benefit. And whereas Alan and Violet have shown their appreciation for the community who supported them during Violet's battle with cancer by selflessly donating their lotto winnings to various charitable organizations, and where it was the largest appreciation and recognition of the wonderful work performed by these charitable organizations that led them to donate over $11 million. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of this House of Assembly agree that what people around the world are saying about Alan and Violet Large and recognize that they represent some of the finest attributes of the human spirit in terms of charity and goodwill within their community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Alan and Violet Large, a hard-working couple, retired in Truro after having spent 30 years working in Ontario, and whereas Mr. and Mrs. Large, a quiet couple who had strong values about the importance of family, friends, and community, won $11.2 million in July of this year, and whereas Alan and Violet Large, believing they already had everything they needed from saving carefully for their retirement and recognizing the financial difficulties of others, gave away 90% of their winnings to family and community organizations such as churches, fire departments, and the hospital. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature acknowledges the selfless expressions of generosity demonstrated by Alan and Violet Large and thank them for being such positive role models in our community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Remembrance Day will be celebrated throughout our country on November the 11th, whereas members of the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 150 in Arishat will hold a number of events in memory of those who made the ultimate sacrifice, whereas following a supper for their members on Friday night, a pre-Remembrance Day ceremony will be held at St. Anne's Centre, while on Remembrance Day a service will be held at St. Hyacinth's Parish Church, followed by a wreath-laying ceremony at Branch 150 Legion, and concluding with a lunch and entertainment. Therefore, be it resolved, members of the House of Assembly congratulate Branch 150 President Paul Sampson, the executive, veterans, and the entire membership for their continued efforts to celebrate Remembrance Day so that we may never forget the sacrifices made by so many to ensure our freedom. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas there are close to 2,400 members and 100 4-H clubs in Nova Scotia dedicated to the development of young people to help them become responsible members of society by building leadership and entrepreneurial skills. And whereas every year during the county's 4-H annual fall banquet, recognition is given to rural leaders who pledge and uphold the 4-H motto, learn to do by doing, and that have reached a 5-year milestone in leader tenure from the 4-H Council. And whereas 4 dedicated leaders from Victoria County are being honoured for their commitment to the 4-H program. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate and give thanks to our rural 4-H leaders, Nelson Edge, 15 years from Armagh 4-H Club, Joseph Berard, 5 years, Angus Nicholson, 15 years, and Nelson Peterson, 20 years from Bedeck Valley 4-H Club. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas all Nova Scotians will achieve better health and a sense of achievement through active participation in recreational sports. And whereas the Liverpool Bantam Privateers baseball team members Mitchell Alexander, Brad Murray, Tyler Daphne, Lucas Wynot, Ty Whalen, John McCachran, Sam Harding, Thomas Harvey, Lucas Harvey, Michael Crabb, Matthew Oikel, Marshall Young, Candace Wiggle, Ryan Foster, head coach Barry Whalen, assistant coaches Kevin Huskins and Robert Oikel had the sense of achievement as they captured the provincial R Division title for baseball this summer. And whereas it has taken 7 long years for the team to win gold for their hometown with the support of parents and fans. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly recognize the Liverpool Bantam Privateers baseball team members Mitchell Alexander, Brad Murray, Tyler Daphne, Lucas Wynot, Ty Whalen, John McCachran, Sam Harding, Thomas Harvey, Lucas Harvey, Michael Crabb, Matthew Oikel, Marshall Young, Candace Wiggle, Ryan Foster, head coach Barry Whalen, assistant coaches Kevin Huskins and Robert Oikel for having captured the provincial R Division baseball title this summer. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Remembrance Day will be celebrated throughout our country on November the 11th, and whereas members of the Royal Canadian Legion Branch 110 in Lardwes will hold a number of events in memory of those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Whereas following a supper for their members on Saturday night, Remembrance Day events will include a service at Holy Guardian Angel Church, a ceremony at the Community Centre, followed by a lunch at the Legion. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate Branch 110 President Teresa Clements, the Executive, veterans, and the entire membership for their continued efforts to celebrate Remembrance Day so that we may never forget the sacrifices made by so many to ensure our freedom. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable PC Leader in the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1960, 50 veterans of the Second World War met at St. Michael's Church in Wedgeport to begin a plan to create a Royal Canadian Legion in their village. And whereas 50 years later, at a banquet on June 19, 2010, Charles Campbell, president of Branch 155 of the Royal Canadian Legion in Wedgeport, presented medals marking 50 years of service to the last 3 surviving members of the original group. And whereas Gérald Poche, Willard Leblanc, and Alcide Leblanc all served in World War II, both overseas and on the home front. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me congratulating branch number 155 of the Royal Canadian Legion on its long and prosperous history, and thank Gérald Poche, Willard Leblanc, and Alcide Leblanc for the dedicated service to their country and to their community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 30 years ago this year, Terry Fox set out across Canada on his Marathon of Hope, and since then, Canadians and people around the world have commemorated his heroism by participating in the annual Terry Fox Run. And whereas Bedford resident Janine Theriot has heeded Fox's call to keep going without me by participating in the Terry Fox Run each year, and every year each and every year since its inception. And whereas the devotion of people like Janine has made the Terry Fox Run a success and helped it raise over $400 million in support of research to find a cure for all forms of cancer. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House recognize Janine as an inspiration in her own right, commend her commitment to those affected by cancer, and congratulate her for keeping Terry Fox's dream alive. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Sheen Co-op in Inverness has received the Environmental Excellence in a Small Business Operation Award at the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce Small Business Week Dinner. And whereas the Sheen Co-op management team has achieved this award by replacing the refrigeration system and by installing LED lighting, which will reduce their carbon emissions. And whereas the Sheen Co-op is a leader, providing example to other small business by reducing its environmental footprint and improving the competitiveness of its cost structure. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Sheen Co-op for its commitment to corporate and environmental responsibility and for its initiative and awareness of renewable energy technology. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to present this on behalf of the member for Halifax Clayton Park. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Monday, November 1st, 2010, the Heart Stroke Foundation of Nova Scotia launched their Heart and Stroke Bright Red campaign. And whereas the Heart and Stroke Bright Red is the first major campaign launched by the foundation with a goal of raising $1.8 million. And whereas this campaign will help build research capability in our province by funding the new graduate research award program and create safer communities through Nova Scotia by funding the replacement of automatic external defibrillators and provisions of associated training through a program known as Restart a Heart, Restart a Life. Therefore, it be resolved that members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating the Heart and Stroke Foundation for their initiative in making our province healthier and safer, and extend our appreciation and best wishes to the Heart and Stroke Bright Red Leadership Council for a successful campaign. And I ask for waiver.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this year the ladies at the Middle River Alderwood Auxiliary were once again rocking to raise money for the Alderwood Rest Home in their recent annual Rockathon, and whereas a mini concert as part of the fundraising effort brought together local talent for music, song and storytelling, and whereas proceeds from the events are used to help Alderwood Rest Home and its residents. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this Legislative Assembly congratulate the Middle River Alderwood Auxiliary on another successful event and thank them for all their efforts. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Mr. Speaker, I present this on behalf of the honourable member from Dartmouth East. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jim Smith of Dartmouth was first elected to Halifax Regional Council in October 2000, representing District 9, the constituency of Albro Lake, Harbourview. Whereas Councillor Smith was re-elected in 2004 and 8 to Halifax Regional Council, and whereas Councillor Smith was elected Deputy Mayor for Halifax Regional Council on November 2nd, 2010, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House join me in congratulating Councillor Jim Smith on his election as Deputy Mayor of Halifax Regional Council and wish him every success in his new role. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's volunteer fire brigades have been an integral part of rural communities for decades, and whereas these volunteers dedicate both time and effort to ensure the members of their community have the best fire protection possible, and whereas 3 generations of the Condon family, Kenneth, his son Douglas, and his grandson Christopher have served as volunteer firemen in Colchester North, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Christopher Condon for receiving the Firefighter of the Year Award from the Great Village and District Fire Brigade and for carrying on the proud tradition of his family. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Child's Voice Foundation is a national not-for-profit organization dedicated to creating and managing programs that support the physical and emotional well-being of disadvantaged children with illness and disabilities. And whereas 8-year-old Maya Harvey, who attends Brooklyn District Elementary School, recently had her long hair cut for a second time as a donation to a Child's Voice Foundation, where it will become a hairpiece for a child in need. And whereas educating our children at a young age about the importance of charities and what those organizations mean to the lives of others will inspire them to continue into the future with admiration for charity work. Therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize and applaud Maya Harvey on her generosity and selflessness. Mr. Speaker, I'd request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Sherry Fitch is an author, educator, and literary advocate who has written more than 25 books for children and adults, and whereas Ms. Fitch, who has won numerous awards for her work, has been a workshop leader and literacy educator, a keynote conference speaker, has traveled the world to promote literacy, and is the inspiration for the Sherry Fitch Adult Learner Scholarships given annually from monies raised in the Peter Zowski Invitational Golf Tournaments for Literacy, and is the honorary spokesperson for the Nova Scotia Read to Me program, and whereas Ms. Fitch, a graduate of Acadia University, was awarded an honorary degree last May from St. Thomas University in recognition of her influence in the national and international literary world, therefore be it resolved that the members of this Legislative Assembly congratulate Sherry Fitch on her accomplishments and express their thanks for her contributions to literacy at home and abroad. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable PC Leader in the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Joe Bichera founded the Maple Grove Memorial Club in 1985 as a way for the school to show support for veterans, current serving military members, and war dead, and has grown to include other Yarmouth County schools and boasts more than 140 members. Whereas the Memorial Club has held its Silver Cross ceremony with songs and words of remembrance on June 5th, amid tears and smiles from parents, relatives, and friends of soldiers who died in Afghanistan. Whereas the Silver Crosses are given to the fathers of soldiers from Nova Scotia who have died while serving in Afghanistan and are a modified version of the Maltese Cross, which were designed by the students in 2006 and have the soldiers' names engraved on the back. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me in congratulating Joe Bichera and all the students who have been members of the Memorial Club and thank them for 25 years of dedicated service to veterans and their families, as well as wish Joe a happy retirement and success in his future endeavors. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Trans-Canada Trail has provided Nova Scotians with an opportunity to get out into fresh air and take part in an activity that promotes healthy lifestyles. And whereas when completed, the Auburn-Kings County multi-use trail will provide users an experience second to none. And whereas Bob Wright and the Kings County Trail Society have worked extremely hard to build the Auburn Trail and make it into a positive experience for all. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly recognize Bob Wright and the Kings County Trail Society for their hard work and dedication and wish them continued success in all future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ally MacDonald of Port Hawkesbury has a key role in Score, a hockey musical, which is one of Canada's most successful movies of 2010. And whereas Ms. MacDonald was part of the prestigious opening of the 2010 Toronto International Film Festival for her role as Eve in that film. And whereas Ally was dedicated to her craft at an early age, from her first movie role at the age of 9 to being selected as one of only 40 students to attend the Canadian College of Performing Arts in Victoria, BC. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Ally on her artistic achievements and wish her continued success in the film industry. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Oh my. Whereas more than 300 municipal leaders were on hand in downtown Toronto at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities 73rd Annual Conference when former Windsor Mayor Anna Allen was recognized for 17 years of municipal public service and for her devotion and committed belief in trying to get more women to run for municipal office. And whereas Anna was the recipient of the Anne McLean Award for Outstanding Service by a Woman in Municipal Politics, an award named in honour of New Glasgow's former mayors, and whereas Anna received the award for recognition of exemplary service to her community and to the mentoring of women who want to run for municipal government. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate former Windsor Mayor Anna Allen on receiving this distinguished award at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Conference and wish her every future success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Those against say nay. The motion is carried. Any further notices of motion? If not, I'll recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call Bill number 81, Oak Island Treasure Act?
Bill number 81, the Oak Island Treasure Act. The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise for debate on the second reading of the amendments to the Special Places Protection Act. I would like to begin today, Mr. Speaker, by acknowledging the efforts of the Honourable Member for Hants East, the Minister of Natural Resources, and our government for bringing forward the repeal of the Treasure Trove Act and creating the Oak Island Treasure Act. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to say how pleased I was to see the Honourable Member from Dartmouth East speaking in support of the government's actions at yesterday's or the day before's bill briefing. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge all of the speakers that spoke yesterday with respect to this bill. Clearly, the official opposition recognizes that we have made the best decision for Nova Scotians in this matter. Introducing these changes to treasure hunting regulations will bring the province in line with other Canadian provinces in the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. It will also help ensure the preservation and protection of marine heritage resources in all of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the Special Places Protection Act plays an important part in keeping that commitment. Amendments to the Special Places Protection Act will remove all references to treasure. Mr. Speaker, these amendments will help ensure that the Act continues to follow best practices in heritage research and that it continues to allow for the preservation and study of our cultural and ecological heritage. To reiterate, Mr. Speaker, what the Minister of Natural Resources has said, we know that Nova Scotians want our history to be researched, and we know that they want it to be interpreted right here in the province of Nova Scotia, not sold to collectors from outside the province. Mr. Speaker, we believe that artifacts and shipwrecks, along with our coast, belong to Nova Scotians. We've reviewed research and best practices and will act to protect this history. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Tourism, Culture and Heritage looks forward to working with the Department of Natural Resources to implement the repeal of the Treasure Trove Act and changes to the Special Places Protection Act. In doing this, we are ensuring that important pieces of Nova Scotia's history stay in this province to benefit learning and research. People generations from now will be thanking us for what we are doing here. Staff in the Heritage Division are already looking at ways to enhance our approach to preserving and researching marine heritage. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of the amendments to the Special Places Protection Act, and I will now take my place. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
To close.
Oh, if I recognize the Honourable Minister, it will be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, really pleased to stand up and thank all members who had something to say on Bill 81. I have to say, I guess one of the good things about this legislature is the variety of experiences that members bring, and interesting the little tidbits of information. I appreciate the comments of the member from Digby Annapolis. I usually appreciate the comments of the member of Digby Annapolis, but certainly he threw a little other component into what we might deem to be treasure items. The member for Inverness, I thought really Oak Island seemed to be a long way from Inverness, but he made a nice connection. And haven't read the R.B. Harris book, but I'm going to. My colleague from Lunenburg West, spoke quite passionately about the legislation, about the history, and saying that the bill we repealed had gone by its best before date. But the best before date on this legislation is perpetuity. That these treasures belong to the people and will stay there unless people make application through the Minister of Tourism, Heritage and Culture's office for artifacts, heritage licenses, and I appreciate his support and his comments. My colleague, the member for Chester St. Margaret's, I thought threw another interesting dimension to the history. And with that, I thank all members for their support and move second reading of Bill 81, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The question is for second reading of Bill number 81. Is the House ready for the question? Question's been called. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 81, an act to regulate the searching for treasure on Oak Island in Lunenburg County and to repeal Chapter 477 of the revised statutes 1989, the Treasure Trove Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 82, the Offshore Licensing Policy Act?
Bill number 82, the Offshore Licensing Policy Act. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to making a few comments on this wet and wild Friday morning. And let me assure you that if you're anywhere near the coast, of course, today, I know there are members out there, and I urge you as you're making your way down our fabulous South Shore to take your time, be careful, and watch for those offshore winds, that's for sure. You know, there are some issues, Mr. Speaker, that as whether we're on the side of the House we're on, we have common ties. And, you know, for those who might be watching this morning or reading these comments later in Hansard, there's certain ties that just go across this floor. I mean, and certain members of this House are well aware of the fact that if it ever comes to the time later on in life where I'm at a Stanley Cup final in Boston and, you know, you're there and you need a good seat, just give me a call. And, you know, I've said that so many times that, and people are always surprised. They are genuinely surprised. The student who was here with me the other day was surprised when, well, she wasn't surprised, she was pleasantly surprised that throughout that day there was opportunities for some of you to meet this young woman, Nikki Giles from Prospect Bay, right down in the water, very close to Brookside Junior High. And she was surprised with the fact that I would say to her, here's one of my friends, and this is Mr. So-and-so. Her question was, after some of you had walked away, now is he liberal, or is he conservative, or is he with you guys? And as you well know, as we know in this business that we're in, and maybe we should call it more than a business, a sport, or whatever else you want to say, you know, there are amongst us some very common ties. You know, I see that between the good member from Hants West and the member from Sackville-Cobequid. You know, they shared a career, and they have lots of common interests. And, you know, the member from Hants West in particular has been giving some sage advice lately to me as a minister. I'm not quite sure where he's got all his expertise in some of the topics, and I see him point his finger at me. But, you know, I think the key thing here and where I'm going with this is that, Mr. Speaker, I've already been interrupted here, see? I want to use this as an example, and I'll use it particularly with the member from Digby-Annapolis. The member from Digby-Annapolis was introduced to my student friend who was here from my constituency, and after that member had, actually we had walked away from him, he was standing somewhere else, Nikki said to me, "You like him, don't you?" And I said, "Of course I like him. You know, he's genuine. He represents his constituency well. He stands in his place in this House." And I did bring up the example of George's Bank because she had been at the briefing, and she said to me at that time, "And you listen to him, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, I do listen to him. He doesn't give me any choice." And that's one of the things that I think we all understand when legislation is coming forward, when debate is underway. You know, you and I, members of this side of the House, we're going to have our differences. But they, in my opinion, must also be opinion differences, points of view differences. And they must not, under any circumstances, stoop to the level of personality differences. And at no time, and I certainly can't use his proper name, at no time can the member from Digby-Annapolis and myself have that sort of differences. We must, after all, remember to the fact that we have points of view, and we're going to continue to have differences. And after a good discussion, we'll have consensus. And maybe sometime when he is in Boston and wants a ticket to the NHL finals in a couple of years' time, I'll get him a ticket. As an old friend and as a colleague and as someone who has had a great deal of influence on this Minister of Energy on this particular topic. And I should also, if I may at this time, Mr. Speaker, and I know that I have some comments which my staff in Energy has drafted for me, and they're always very leery of the fact He hasn't even begun the prepared part of his notes yet. I must also turn, I have to get some things on the record, though. The member from Argyle has to understand this. I have to get some of the proper things on the record. I must also thank my good friend from Shelburne. You know, when you're invited out with two fishermen and they'll say to you, and I have a safe way to get home that evening, we'll pick up the tab. I know eventually, I know inevitably, the topic is going to be George's Bank. It's just going to happen. And I'm going to be in that situation where I'm going to be, as a teacher, have the wonderful opportunity to become the student as I listen to these men and their fervent feelings for what they feel should happen to this fabulous resource off our coast. First-hand information from people who feel passionately about the topic. And I also must include at this time, a member from Argyle, when you're inheriting the traditions that he has, as he's pointed out to us in this house many times, he has my interest when he says that his grandfather, his father, and he himself have worked on the offshore, have worked out there in that dangerous fishing situation. That gets my attention. So when that member wants to have his particular point of view on this topic, this teacher becomes a student and listens. So this is going to continue as we proceed through this process. And, you know, members in this House have heard me speak about law amendments and how important it is. You know, if you really want to be on a committee that's of some consequence in this legislative process, law amendments, and I know that our visiting clerk from Manitoba probably can talk about law amendments in her jurisdiction, but it's nothing like the one we have here. It is nothing like the one we have here. People come off the street, well, they have to make an appointment now, right? They come into our legislature. They have an opportunity to speak on the topic of the day, the bill that is going to be changed, and some of them have changed quite drastically over there. And I encourage members as we go through this piece of legislation to make sure that you encourage people to come forward and have their point of view on this particular topic. This is a topic of great emotional value. This is a topic that means a great deal to Nova Scotians. And I can assure you, as the Minister, I look forward to continuing to receive advice, whether it's from members of the House here, whether it's from people who appear from law amendments, or people such as Denny Moreau. You know, when I first had the opportunity to meet with the No Rigs 3 coalition, my first question, of course, not being afraid to ask the occasional dumb question, I asked Mr. Moreau, so No Rigs 3, where was No Rigs 1 and No Rigs 2? And immediately, he begins to give me the history. That is, after all, that coalition, as soon as you see the number 3 there, you're aware these people have been at this for a while. And that, again, was another learning experience. So with those comments, I'd like to, and I'll come back to a couple other opportunities during my comments where I'll be not sticking so closely to the text. Digressing? I haven't even started the speech yet.
You're just boring now.
Anyway, it's my honor and my pleasure to speak on Bill 82, the Offshore Licensing Policy Act, an act respecting the moratorium on the petroleum activity on George's Bank. Mr. Speaker, it's clear to us that extending the moratorium on oil and gas activity on George's Bank is just simply the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. George's is important to Nova Scotians. It's important to our fishing industry. And as we heard in the House yesterday, it's important to a lot of members of this House. And I thank them for their comments inside and outside of the House. In a moment, I'll provide some greater detail as to our intention with this moratorium extension, and I'll speak to some of the questions that have been raised since it was introduced on Wednesday, November 3rd. And earlier, I misspoke. Those comments that were made in the House were not made yesterday, they were made the previous day. We believe this bill, in its wording and its approach, achieves the right legislative protection for George's Bank. And it clearly solidifies the position of the province of Nova Scotia in regards to this important part of our offshore. And it's important to remember this is a shared jurisdiction with the federal government and, of course, our friends to the south, United States of America. Our action in this legislature through this bill is a necessary step, however, as we continue to work with the federal government to have it also enshrined in the Accord Acts and to take a leadership role. On so many occasions, on whatever side of the House I was on, or am now on, would say, well, you know, that's a federal jurisdiction. That's something else that we have to talk to our partners in Ottawa about. This is an issue that Nova Scotians expect us to take some leadership on. And then, as we proceed, to make sure we get the details in place. And I look forward to working with the appropriate federal ministers. I look forward to hearing from other parts of the country. And of course, I look forward to hearing from our American friends to the south on what they think of this piece of legislation. Before I get into some specifics, I do want to reiterate for the record what it is we're trying to achieve with this bill with extending the moratorium indefinitely. We are not the first government, Mr. Speaker, to recognize Georges Bank as a special and unique place. It's a sensitive marine ecosystem that has been closed to exploration and drilling since 1988. And to those previous governments, I thank them for that particular decision. Since 1988, however, there has been that constant shadow there lurking. What is going to happen? Is this another battle we're going to have to fight? I think it's time that we made it very clear that there's going to be no drilling on Georges Bank for an indefinite period. But the way that this has worked is that there has always been an expiration date for when the moratorium needs to be reviewed. This causes anxiety in the fishing sector, in Southwest Nova, and in Nova Scotia generally. Nova Scotians and all those who value Georges Bank, they have this constant fear that the moratorium could be lifted. Not anymore. We're saying very clearly the moratorium will stay in place until such time as there is a compelling reason for us to review it, not because an arbitrary date has been reached. Rather than continuing this ongoing debate, our legislation will provide certainty about our intentions around Georges Bank. Exploration and drilling activities will not happen in this area of our offshore unless factors such as science, technology, environmental protection provide us with full confidence to proceed. As I've said many times before, publicly, privately, over a couple of refreshments from my friends from Shelburne and Digby Annapolis, it's just not worth the risk to drill in an area this important to Nova Scotians with the knowledge that we have. And on that topic, as members opposite know, I have the fortunate duties to represent a number of fishing villages, Lower Prospect and Prospect Village itself, and of course, Terrence Bay. And I would be remiss not to mention that a number of the young men that I've had in the teaching profession are proud of the fact that they're fishermen. William Slonwhite in particular, now there's a name I could eliminate everybody in Terrence Bay who wasn't named Slonwhite. It would be like eliminating the D'Entremonts and the Publicos. And why we want to eliminate them, my God, they're the heart and soul of the earth. And when people such as William Slonwhite, who makes his living on the water, whether he's working further down in Southwest Nova or he's working at a Terrence Bay, he brings it up with me in a social situation, protect Georges Bank. And he does call me by my first name at that time. Good to see some of these students eventually do that. And I said to William at the time, not Bill, not Billy, William, I said to William at the time, you know, just wait. When the government gets things going, this is just after we've been elected, there will be some positive news, hopefully, about Georges Bank. So there's someone else that we have to listen to when we make these decisions. The bill does extend the moratorium indefinitely. It requires a public hearing. And most importantly for me, as an elected official, it requires a vote in the legislature to lift it. That's a real significant issue. Because I know in the community that I'm fortunate enough to represent, if this ever did happen during my term as energy minister, on the doorsteps on a Friday afternoon, whether it's rain or a beautiful sunny day in Terrence Bay or Lower Prospect, that would be a question that would be put to me. It would be a question that would be put to me, why would I even consider, or how did I vote in that debate when it comes to lifting the moratorium? That is what we shall always have, a ballot box issue in coastal Nova Scotia. That ensures that in this House, in this historic legislature, Each one of us will stand in his or her place if and when that ever happens, and you will have to have your say on what you think would be the compelling reasons for lifting this moratorium. The comment yesterday that a resolution of the House and a vote in the legislature was just not strong enough was interesting. I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but it was interesting, and I'll leave it at that. The suggestion was that any future government at any time could overturn what we're trying to achieve here. That's absolutely true. That's democracy. Short of a constitutional amendment, every government, with the support of the majority of members in the House, can repeal any piece of legislation in this House. What we can do, though, is make it clear what a future government should do, and we can enshrine it in our legislation. And that's exactly what we've done. That's exactly what we've done. If a future government sees a compelling reason to revisit the issue, they must come to the House, they must engage in a public debate. We've written in 3 barriers they must pass: scientific evidence, a public review, and a vote after a debate in this historic House. That says to me that is a good, safe way of ensuring that this piece of legislation will not be tampered with and will be respected. And Mr. Speaker, I have faith in the democratic process. We're assuring that no future government can quietly lift the protection we are applying to Georgia's Bank in this bill. This is an emotional, this is an important topic. This is a topic that people throughout Nova Scotia, not just in the coastal communities, and God bless them as they continue to survive. This is a topic of interest in suburban Timberley. This is a topic of interest in Cape Breton, whether your fathers were coal miners or fishermen. This is part of the Nova Scotia heritage. Georgia's Bank is just that valuable that we know it. It's historic. I'm sure that if people would look, understand the things that were attracted to come to Nova Scotia, whether it's Peggy's Cove, whether it's, of course, the Highlands of Cape Breton, we can't arrange, maybe the member from Digby-Yiannopoulos could think about this as a future idea. We can't arrange to have boat tours of Georgia's Bank, but boy, considering that tour you took us on here one night a number of years ago, a number of months ago, that'd be worth the money no matter what you charged us. We must be open. We must be transparent. We must be accountable to this House. And in situations such as this, we face the people. That's the protection we're providing for Georgia's Bank. I have confidence in the process, and I hope you'll share that confidence with me. Mr. Speaker, I also want to provide assurances that this legislation does not mean we do not have faith in our ability to regulate the offshore. Regulation in the offshore is one of the strong suits in Nova Scotia. I have faith in that as the Minister of Energy. Georgia's Bank represents between 5 to 10% of the prospective area of offshore Nova Scotia. The rest of our offshore does not contain some of the unique characteristics of Georgia's. But I have full confidence in our regulatory and environmental assessment system to permit petroleum activity in these other areas. In fact, this government is investing $15 million to improve the geoscience available in these other potentially lucrative areas. We can never know enough about the sensitive areas of the offshore, and particularly Georgia's Bank. It's imperative that we understand the implications of any development activity in this area on the fisheries and the ecosystem. This is about making sure the right science is there to demonstrate the fisheries and ecosystem will not be harmed. We are taking a decisive stand in protecting this area of our offshore and its valuable resources. We will assure Nova Scotians this moratorium is important to you and it's important to us. Our legislation provides clear direction on maintaining the moratorium until there is a compelling reason. To not do so anymore is just not correct. Straightforward legislation. It's about establishing a policy direction and process in regards to the area of our offshore. Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. I was asked yesterday by a member from the media why we're not lining ourselves up with the United States in doing this with regards to Georgia's Bank. And I want to assure members of the House and members of the media and Nova Scotians that we're continuing to consult and work with our American friends, and of course, the federal government in Ottawa. They are all important players in this decision, but we're taking the lead in doing what we know is right for Nova Scotia. We believe Georges Bank is a special place that deserves special protection. We value and respect our ocean ecosystem. We also believe there is a value in further scientific research in the area. Excuse me again, Mr. Speaker. Particularly with limited and focused seismic, so we can better understand the geology of this broader area. No commercial exploration activity can occur, and I would suggest even if they were permitted, and they are not, no company would want to invest in a seismic program in an area where they can't drill. The only seismic activity that could occur in the future would be for scientific research purposes. For example, we used yesterday the one at the technical briefing. There could be the example that future possible work by the Geological Survey of Canada. In fact, we also have another organization, the Offshore Energy Environmental Research Association, the OEER as it's called, that does environmental research work in the offshore, and they may want to undertake research on the impacts of oil and gas activity in Georges Bank, including impacts of seismic on marine habitat and species in the area. This is valuable information to have, and any seismic would be subject to rigorous regulatory and environmental review processes. I have confidence that any research would not harm the marine habitat and sensitive ecosystem of the area. This is a strong bill, in my opinion, that for now and in the future provides the appropriate protection for Georges Bank. Mr. Speaker, it has been a pleasure as the Minister of Energy to introduce various pieces of legislation in this House. Legislation that deals with regulatory changes, legislation that deals with things that we continue to work with in resources when we look at wind turbines and tidal activities. These are all important parts of my duties as an energy minister. But I can assure you that if and when the time comes when I step away from this job, this will be a piece of legislation that I am proud to say I was the minister that brought it forward. With those comments, I'll take my place. I look forward to the debate. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I'll now recognize the honourable member for Digby-Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today and speak on Bill 81. Bill 82, excuse me. Everyone knows in this House where I stand when it comes to the Georges Bank area. For 15 generations, my family's been in the fishery. And for probably that many generations, we've realized of what that bank is to not only my family, but every family from Cape Cod to Cape Breton to the head of the Bay of Fundy. And that's a lot of people and a lot of families, 2 different countries and in 2 different provinces. That is one of the biggest and greatest nurseries in the world for fish. And I would argue that with anybody, debate anybody, that any day. And it's been proven that. And with 2 million more people coming on this earth in the next 50 years, or 2 billion more people, we're going to wonder where our food's going to come from. We know the wild fishery can't feed us, but we know that bank can give us a great share of that food of the wild fishery. We know we need to grow more fish, but we also realize that there's a lot at stake here for letting something go on that bank of drilling for oil that could put that bank in jeopardy to wipe out the Gulf of Maine. And I just want to touch a minute on the Gulf of Mexico of what happened in that area, which could happen in the Gulf of Maine just as easy. We've seen one of the greatest disasters so far on this earth happen in the Gulf of Mexico. But if that disaster ever happened on the Georges Bank, with the amount of tide and circulation that goes from Cape Breton to the head of the Bay of Fundy to Cape Cod, we would see a disaster 10 times worse, if not greater, than what we've seen in the Gulf of Mexico with no tide in the deep water that they were in. The tide on that Georges Bank, and I've been there and lived it, it turns counterclockwise and spins off just like a huge, huge low pressure in our atmosphere. And it's the whole size of the Gulf of Maine. So just imagine if oil was pumping out of the ground there and spinning out into that in this Gulf. I can only imagine it. I don't want to see it. I don't even want to imagine it. But with that, and with this bill, this is a fairly good bill. Fairly good. But it's not good enough. What you've done here, Mr. Minister, and I want to thank you for the kind words you spoke about me, and I can repeat those words right back to you as a person that I've come to like very much. But this bill, I don't know if I'd like it that much. You've extended this bill. All you've done is extend the moratorium for 3 more years, not even to the time that the Americans had at 2017. This only goes to 2015. And this bill can be squashed in this House. You can do a resolution today. This government could do a resolution in this House today, and you all vote for it, and that bill can pass, that resolution can pass to open up this legislation again, to stop this legislation. That's how I read this bill. And I'll tell you what else this bill's also done. And I want to quote something. And this quote comes from you, Mr. Minister. And it says, rather than continue this debate every few years, our legislation will provide certainty about our intentions around Georges Bank. And it says, it has been closed. It is a sensitive marine ecosystem that has been closed to exploration and drilling since a moratorium was placed on it under the Accord Acts in 1988. This bill now is only going to stop drilling. It is opening up exploration. It's opening up for seismic testing. And there's been a ban on that. So this bill needs to be looked at. This bill needs to be looked at to see why, if we're going to try to continue a moratorium on Georges Bank, you know, and it should be for definite, not indefinite, unless science can say down the road that it can be done, and I don't know if that will ever happen. But this needs to be looked at, this seismic testing. How safe is that on that bank of shoal water? Does anybody, I mean, I don't know if that question can be answered, because I don't know, I haven't heard of any safe seismic testing being done on fishing grounds. There was some done up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence a few years back, and the fishery up there, the fishermen still say that had done damage to the crab fishery where it was done. So what are we opening up here with the bill of letting exploration go on? I'm not sure, but I think it needs to be looked at. And I'm hoping that somebody will come to law amendments and maybe explain this to us, that maybe this isn't a good bill. But it is a bill that will keep a moratorium on here. If it's not opened back up by this government, it'll keep it on 3 more years, from 2012 to the original moratorium to 2015. That's how I read this, and I don't read it any different. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to take up too much more time. There's other speakers here that want to speak on this, but I'll be pleased to see this to go to law amendments and to see the reaction that happens at there. So with that, I'll take my seat. Thank you.
Thank you, honourable member. I'll now recognize the PC leader in the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand and spend a few moments talking to this bill. And I want to thank the minister for bringing this to discussion, to bring the bill forward, to bring the idea, to start the discussion. Because quite like the member for Digby Annapolis, I think this starts the discussion, but it is by far not the end of the discussion. You know, I think we've talked about, you know, stopping drilling on Georges Bank. And what this really does, Mr. Speaker, is takes away maybe some of the public discussion that has happened in the past. I want to go back a little bit, and in my statement the other day when the Minister of Energy brought this to the House to the floor of the House of Assembly, I talked about my community. I talked about my family participating in the fishery for many generations, really. It was our Acadians that came to the Rocky Shores after the deportation, who were fishermen, or who were farmers, and had to learn to become fishermen, and who plied the waters of the near shore, and slowly, over time, learned to go further and further off. And I'm very proud that my family was one of those families that have gotten so much life from Georges Bank. You know, like I said, my dad's a scholar fisherman, was a scholar fisherman, just retired, and my dad is 63 years old. Okay, I know the minister is not quite there, but he's old enough. He's almost old enough to be my dad. But my dad retired this year, or just around December of last year, and he had been a fisherman for 47 years. You know, at the tender age of 14, 15, he left school to support his family and had been on the water since that time. And I can say that, you know, being a young whippersnapper and finally have the opportunity to get on the boat and make some money, I took that opportunity. It was the longest 12 days of my life. I can tell you, it is the longest time. They go out for 12 days on Georges Bank. And when the weather is nice, I know the member for Digby Annapolis has talked about the beauty of Georges Bank, and he's talked about the other side of Georges Bank. And Georges Bank can be one of the roughest, loneliest places you've ever been in your whole life. And I can tell you that when we had the opportunity to touch land again, and I don't know, but my family is not what you call a huggy family. And I like to hug people, but my family we weren't sort of the huggy family. And I can tell you, when I got off that boat, that I gave my dad the biggest hug that I had ever given him, ever. To think that he had done that for his family, for me, that hard work. I mean, and he didn't start as a captain of a boat. He started on, geez, I can't even remember the name of the boat that he started on, but, you know, in the day of making it easy, those boats weren't easy. And I know the Minister of Fisheries is shaking his head. They didn't have what's called a dumping deck. So every drag that dragged the stuff from the bottom of the ocean, dumped it on the deck. They had to take all those big boulders and rocks that came up with the scallops, and by hand, chuck them overboard. You know, and then take the fish, and then bring them, and then chuck it, and then bring it in. So, I mean, it's quite a job. And I remember during my time of ups and downs on Georges Bank where there was fish and there wasn't fish. And I remember a time when, you know, if they came in with 300 bags or 200 bags on the offshore boats, was a good trip. And today they're lucky enough now that the fishery has really come back, is doing very well, and they're coming in with 1,000 bags or more. So that it had its ups and downs. But But that's just the scallop fishery, you know, and my connection to it. There's the groundfish fishery. There's the herring fishery. There's the swordfish fishery. There's a tuna fishery not too far from Georges Bank. Every bit of fish, you know, we talk about our $1 billion fishing industry in Nova Scotia. I don't know what Georges Bank's component out of that $1 billion fishery is, but it's a good chunk of it. It's a damn good chunk. I don't know if it's half or sort of little less than half. I mean, I know a lobster fishery does take in a lot of value as well. But should we have a disaster on that bank, it would be disastrous for not only the little communities that dot the coastline. It'll be devastating for the economy of Nova Scotia. We talk about drilling and offshore oil, and we've already seen we're already on the downside of the bell curve. You know, we've made royalties, they've come up, and they're starting to come down. So it's not dollars that we can depend on in the long term. Georges Bank continually renews itself every year to provide $1 billion or a part of that $1 billion to our economy every single year, and it has done this, you know, forever. Why would we mess with it? You know, my community would tell me very quickly, we need an outright ban on it forever. This bill doesn't really do that. What it does, Mr. Speaker, interestingly enough, is does take some of the public discussion away from it. You know, because of the way it was structured before is that you would put a date. And then as you get close to that date, you got to do some public consultation, you got to do some research, whether you're taking off the moratorium or you're extending that moratorium. And, you know, we've had no rigs 1, we've had no rigs 2, we're working on no rigs 3, and I'm sure there would have been a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 as time rolled on. But what I'm worried about this bill is really, and I don't maybe have an appreciation for exactly how the moratorium or the ban is removed, because from the minister's comments, from what we're reading within the bill, it's, you know, should technology change, should advances be done, should someone approach government with a better way, then they would have a bit of a public consultation to remove that ban, and then a resolution of the House of Assembly will overturn that act. In my mind, that sounds a little easier than what we got today, in my mind. But I mean, I want to really have a look through of exactly what that means. You know, we should get rid of that resolution piece and put that whichever government is in power in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, has to repeal the act. You know, has to do the full work to make sure that the interest of Georges Bank is protected. Mr. Speaker, I know the minister has said this is step 1, and it really is step 1, because there is something that can trump this act, and that is the accord. So the federal government is, of course, a very important part of banning drilling, seismic work, what have you, on Georges Bank. And I'm hoping that they'll look at this bill, suggest changes if need be, and be a partner in what happens for Georges Bank. Because without their support, you know, what we're doing in this House will be wasted. And we don't want it to be wasted. Because I think we all believe that taking a sensitive area like Georges Bank and allowing drilling to happen would be devastating to the ecosystem and of course to our economy. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to travel to Norway a couple of years ago when we were looking at this the first time. And they wanted to see how did a country like Norway allow fishing and drilling to sort of happen in the same place. And it was an interesting conundrum that they sort of had there. And they said, they really talked about sensitive areas. And if you look at how their offshore is blocked, there's a number of places that you can't drill here, you can't drill there, you can't drill there. And we said, well, okay, what constitutes a sensitive area? What is a sensitive area? And they talked about nursery, they talked about an ecosystem, they talked about everything that Georges Bank is. So, Mr. Speaker, I would say that as well as this is step one, I'm hoping that this minister will get on with step 2, 3, 4, and 5, whatever steps it takes to protect Georges Bank forever, for my community, for my family, and for everybody's families here, and for all of Nova Scotia. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to supporting this, but enhancing on this as it goes through the House of Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, first of all, I want to recognize the earlier speakers and the wisdom and the knowledge they bring to this. And I think, looking at my notes, No Rigs 3, I think, summed it up when they talked about this particular bill is the story of the year. So it's going to be hard to follow up on a comment like that. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise in the House today to speak in support of this legislation put forward on oil and gas exploration on Georges Bank. This government has sent a clear message. We are protecting our environment and we are protecting our fishery. Mr. Speaker, I've been asked many times how a Minister of the Crown can be both the Minister of Fisheries and the Minister of Environment. And my answer has always been the same. If you want a healthy fishery, we must care for our environment, protect the environment, and we will most certainly have a healthy fishery. Mr. Speaker, this legislation shows that the health of the environment and that of the fishery go hand in hand. And as a young boy, Mr. Speaker, I spent many a day sailing homemade ships, something that the author William Bliss Carman penned about the poem, The Ships of Yule. So today, it is certainly an honor to stand in my place to speak to the regulations indefinitely banning oil and gas exploration on Georges Bank. As Nova Scotians, we are blessed with the many abundant natural resources, like the wind that filled the sails of the famous Bluenose, and the tidal knowledge that Angus Walters relied on as he successfully engaged in his daily fishing exercises. This government is moving to protect Georges Bank, arguably one of the most precious marine resources. Today, Georges Bank is traditionally fished by Canadians and our American fishers. However, in the 1960s and the 1970s, Poland, and yes, the former Soviet Union fished one of the world's largest herring stocks there. Mr. Speaker, the decision by Canada and the United States to declare an exclusive economic zone of a 200-mile nautical miles in the late 1970s led to the overlapping exclusive zone, economic zone claims on Georges Bank. Both nations agreed in 1979 to defer the question of maritime boundary to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. After 5 years of consultations, the court ruled in 1984 that the maritime boundary in the Gulf of Maine was split between both nations. Today, Canada's portions of the Gulf of Maine includes the northeast portion of Georges Bank. Mr. Speaker, it was the testimony of Nova Scotia's fishermen from the ports like Lunenburg, Yarmouth, Digby, Cape Sable Island, and yes, my hometown of Woods Harbor, and their historical attachment to the fishing on this bank that helped win that court case in The Hague. The history clearly shows our attachment to Georges Bank and the important role that it has and continues to have on our lives. As a society, Mr. Speaker, our addiction to fossil fuel certainly remains high. This government recognizes the importance of a transition to renewable energy, such as the wind and the tidal power that has taken action. We are moving towards becoming one of the world's leaders and renewable energy with our commitment to a 40% renewable energy by 2020. We will not satisfy our energy needs at the expense of our environment or our fishing grounds. This government has shown leadership not only in the development of wind power, but through the support of tidal energy, in which the Bay of Fundy is famous. Our Premier, in August of this year, pushed to get the Bay of Fundy recognized as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. Many times we refer to our province, our oceans, our fisheries, our environment. However, we are simply caretakers who make policies and regulations by placing a ban on oil and gas explorations on Georges Bank. We have set the stage to pass this province on to our children better than we have found it. We know that Nova Scotians are concerned about the protection and the lucrative fishing grounds resources on Georges Bank, especially those who earn their living in the fishing industry. Our fishery supports a vibrant rural communities around the families and lives that live in them. These Nova Scotians rely on the fisheries around Georges Bank that have been very vocal about their concerns regarding oil and gas exploration. They have expressed their fears that development is being planned on Georges, and the activities will commence as soon as the moratorium is lifted. It has been, Mr. Speaker, it has been years of inaction, but this government is listening. We have heard the concerns of our fishermen, our coastal communities, the environmental stakeholders, and from Nova Scotians from all walks of life that care deeply about protecting our beautiful province and our marine resources. We have heard the concerns that oil exploration and development activities may negatively impact the marine ecosystems and the fisheries. I want to recognize the efforts of the coalitions of fishermen, the fishing groups, the environmentalists, and the Aboriginal groups for their persistence to protect the sensitive areas, and I celebrate with them this important step forward. Mr. Speaker, Georges Bank is one of the most biologically productive areas in the North America or North Atlantic. Georges Bank has sustained huge stocks of fish such as herring, cod, haddock, as well as scallops, just to name a few, and other fisheries such as haddock, cod, yellowtail flounder, swordfish, tuna, and almost especially lobsters. It supports major fisheries resources, most of which are conducted out of southwest Nova Scotia. The offshore scallop fisheries has been the second highest landed value of all species fished in Nova Scotia and is largely conducted on the Georges Bank. Mr. Speaker, many in the fishing industry continue to believe that the oil and gas activities on Georges Bank will pose too great a risk for this sensitivity and very protective area. We have heard loudly and clearly these concerns that Nova Scotia have related to the potential oil and gas development on Georges Bank. Mr. Speaker, this government is doing more than just listening to the concerns of Nova Scotia. This government is making a decision that matters to Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, we have taken actions needed and asked for us to ensure that the fishing industry listens and are heard and addressed by balancing the environmental, commercial, and all the other interests of Georges Bank. Mr. Speaker, in closing, my grandfather and father fished from Cape Breton to Grand Banana Island, and it's certainly an honor to speak on this issue. Thank you very much for your time.
I recognize the honourable member from Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to stand and speak on this bill, and Let me start by saying that we do believe this is a step forward. We are supportive of the direction that the government is taking on this. As I said the other day, we just believe that there are ways that this can be strengthened. The minister noted in his remarks that he wasn't sure what our concern was about the resolution and how that might be any different, and I'd like to provide some thoughts on that issue, as well as on the issue of seismic exploration. And frankly, if the minister or his staff have information that would suggest that our position, our concern about there just being a resolution should be amended or reconsidered, we're also happy to do that, of course. You know, Mr. Speaker, I guess the heart of our concern is summarized really well in a quote that was on CBC last night, and I'd like to just read that quote. It said, "Being a conservative environment minister is kind of like being the vice president of veggie burgers at McDonald's." Well, you know, and that's where our concern is. I don't believe this current environment minister or this current energy minister or environment minister would for a second suggest that we should suddenly allow drilling on Georges Bay. I don't. I don't believe that if the member for Digby-Annapolis was the environment minister or the energy minister in the future that he would. But I do believe that there are people who would use the provisions in the Act where they get to appoint a committee and go to public hearings around the province. Public hearings being good, but we all know, and the Minister of Energy and opposition criticized former governments for this, where they stack a committee, they go get the answer they want, they come forward with a resolution, they have a majority government, and in 3 days you can have a resolution debated and passed by this House. Because it can be introduced on one day, it doesn't get unanimous consent, it's called 2 days later, voted on, and it becomes law. The difference with having to repeal the Act is, yes, the majority government can still ultimately do it. Absolutely. Obviously, a majority government could still repeal an Act. The minister is absolutely correct on that. But the difference is that there is a much lengthier process. The repeal of the Act requires the same first reading as the resolution does. It requires a debate at second reading, but then it also requires the Law Amendments Committee, which in addition to the public hearings that have taken place around the province, it allows anybody that last opportunity to come and speak before MLAs, and it lengthens that process and makes sure that in a short 3-day window that the government doesn't suddenly repeal the good work that this bill tries to do. And that is the crux of the concern. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that is reasonably easily solved. And it's reasonably easily solved by removing a line in the Act. And obviously, lawyers, and I'm not one, would have to double check that this would be correct, but that there is a provision here that says that this Act can be overturned by a resolution of the House of Assembly. I can't find the exact line here, but by removing that line in this Act, by just removing that one line, the Act then becomes a permanent ban unless the entire Act is repealed. And the only way to repeal it is actually to go through first reading, second reading, Law Amendments Committee, third reading, and royal assent by the Lieutenant Governor. That makes it a much more cumbersome process for a future government to overturn this Act. And Mr. Speaker, let me reiterate, I do not want anyone in this House to think that I believe that there's anybody sitting here right now who would suggest that we should overturn this. Because I don't believe that. But the minister quite rightfully said that this is the Act for the future. This is an Act that we want to put an end to the constant bickering, and it does put an end to some of it. The whole protests that have to come up every few years. But, Mr. Speaker, I believe that there will be pressure, and that leads me to the second concern, which is on seismic testing. And the second job I had at Fisheries and Oceans years ago was actually monitoring seismic testing in off Sable Island, and it was around the time they were just starting to do some seismic testing work. And one of the concerns from fishermen, and we had to put well, not only myself, but we had to also put some fisheries observers on some of the rigs to watch the impacts of the seismic testing, because in some places, and we were fortunate this did not happen in the gully, in some places, the seismic testing resulted in floating fish kills, and that was what everybody was concerned about. We were very lucky. We were very, very lucky. In the Sable Island case, that didn't happen, and it all went according to plan and so forth. But this bill, while it bans the drilling, and I'm sure the minister will correct me if I'm wrong, but every indication I've had from the comments, both the bill and the comments at the media briefing, is that seismic work would still be permitted. And the fishermen at the briefing expressed concern about that. Because not only is seismic always a risk, and of course it's a risk, and it's a measured risk, but the whole point here is we're trying to take out the measured risk from the Georges Bank. So if you're going to take out the measured risk, take it all out. But the second issue is the only reason you do seismic testing is to see if there's oil and gas there. And so what all you're doing is you are effectively saying, on the one hand, we don't want to have oil and gas exploration there, which we agree with. But on the other hand, you're kind of leaving the door open and saying, well, you know what, if you can build a case for it, then come back and we'll start this whole process of the public hearings and the review and so forth. That troubles me. I don't foresee a time when there will be an exploration method or an extraction method that is 100% safe. I don't see that time. Maybe it'll happen, right? Anything's possible. I don't see, they said that the Deep Horizon wouldn't happen. It's funny to read the documents that were filed with the U.S. Energy Department and note that they said that this is perfect, it's never going to happen. They also said the Titanic was unsinkable. So whether that will ever, I don't know where I would get to that day, but it doesn't matter if you create an act that doesn't require only a resolution to repeal it. If you have to repeal the act, and any government can do that, then they will have to defend that to the public. And so when we look at seismic, I am, like the member from Digby Annapolis and some of the other members, I'm not clear on why we would say you're not allowed to drill, but we're going to allow you to go build the case for drilling in the meantime. And that I know that's most likely not the intent of the Minister of Energy, but that is the message in some respects. And in fact, we've heard from that in the past couple of days. So that is troubling. And so I would prefer to see a bill that does two things. One, that removes the allowance for seismic testing in that location, and two, that just requires the repeal of the act. And I would ask the minister to consider those as options going forward. It is a good bill, but I think it can be better. And why wouldn't we all want to try and make this the most airtight bill we can? Mr. Speaker, you know, I am not a commercial fisherman. I've never been a commercial fisherman. I've spent a lot of time in my life on fishing boats, working for Fisheries Notions. I have spent time as a scallop diver. And in around those areas, one of the things that the member for Digby Annapolis was calling, I keep having to be careful not to call him Junior. One of the things that he keeps saying, what he talks about, is the cyclic effect of the tides. And it's interesting, when you go up scallop diving up in that area, you actually time it to the tides and you ride the tide. So they drop you in at one end of the tide and you basically coast like Superman over the bottom and grab scallops as you go up to your limit. And let me tell you, those tides are strong. There's only one other place, and I've been diving in much of the world, and there's only one other place I've seen tides as strong or as fast as that, and that's up in the Northumberland Strait, which, interestingly enough, is also a good scallop location. And the member for Digby Annapolis is absolutely right. That's a problem if you ever do get a spill there or an accident. It's a real problem because the tides are such that they can spread that much faster than we saw in the Gulf of Mexico. There was much concern in the Gulf of Mexico in the Deep Horizon rig that the loop current would take the oil and disperse it into the Gulf Stream. As far as we know, that hasn't happened. But it is much more likely in a case on Georges Bank because the Gulf Stream very frequently runs directly through. And there are many fishermen that will tell you stories about all of a sudden the sun comes out in the Georges Bank and they jump into the water and they see sea turtles and the water's really warm and, you know, the Gulf Stream, right? We all know that. And so you have a bank that actually the Gulf Stream often runs next to or directly through. And that makes it much more risky than even somewhere like the Gulf of Mexico to begin doing this sort of work. And that's what is of deep concern to me. I think we also need to recognize, and I said this in my response the other day, that there have been test wells drilled on Georges Bank, 10 of them, and none of them had commercial quantities of gas or oil. And there are other locations with potential in offshore Nova Scotia that the industry is able to focus on, and the minister talked about that the other day, and he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. And so we don't need, there's no need to open this area and require or allow for either the exploration or the testing or the investigation, because all it does is it does one of two things. It either creates false hope for the industry that they can do investment in seismic testing, and if they find something, the act will be overturned, or it says to them that, well, we're going to let you spend money, but we're never going to overturn this. Neither one of those is good. One's bad for the industry, and one bad's for the reputation of government. So let's just close it. Let's just say no. We know that the Georges Bank is one of the most productive spawning and fishing areas in the world. It is a nursery ground for much of the North Atlantic. For our fishermen up off Cape Breton, off the Eastern Shore, we know that, in fact, the nutrients that come and come through the Georges Bank supply many of those fishing grounds, in part because of the tidal conditions, in part because of why it's there. We know that that is a unique ecosystem, unlike very many others in the world, certainly unlike any others in the North Atlantic. And so it makes sense to have the protections there. I mean, we just saw the federal government a couple of years ago actually change shipping lanes so that the whales are less impacted in that area. And why did they do that? Because that area is important for even our large mammalian species as well. This is a unique habitat. It is an important habitat. It is one we should do the utmost to protect. And while we absolutely support the intent of government and the direction of government on this, I would ask the minister to consider those two changes, to remove the ability for seismic exploration to take place, to remove that false hope and that false concern that might exist as a result of it, and also to remove the ability of this to be overturned by resolution and require this act to only be able to be repealed through the normal process of the legislature, which would require a full repeal of the act. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I'll take my place.
Recognize the honourable member from Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm so pleased to be standing in my place speaking to Bill number 82, the Offshore Licensing Policy Act. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to give my full support to this minister and this government for making the right decision in placing an indefinite moratorium on oil and gas exploration and drilling on Georges Bank. Mr. Speaker, I have a deep respect, appreciation,